at the back of our brains, there's some kind of, would it be, as they say, gestalt, there's some kind of shape that we're trying to unveil in our work. We have this immensely deep entity, the sea, and we float above it. So I suppose the sea in this piece is, that area is represented by the piano and cello, and the soprano is above it, in a zone of her own above.
That's exactly the feeling when I play it, that I, together with Julius, is sort of this natural force weaving my way as the sea, or as a jellyfish, or whatever kind of animal you've chosen for the cello. And we weave our way round the text and sort of add the oceanic element.
Looking at the score and looking at the strata and looking at the layers and all of those layers of kind of activity, there's something about the visual quality of the score itself that I think is really interesting and analogous to the way that one's actually looking at the sea.
Wallace Stevens is such a classic modernist, but the poems are so hard to understand often. And although, because this is called a Fabliau, it's an allegory of something else, but it's definitely also gives us lots of pictures of the sea. And the second poet, Kathleen Jamie, is a contemporary Scottish poet whom I've set before. And she has a very interesting modern naturalist way of looking at things.
First come the jellyfish. Fringed luminous bones, like lost eternal organs, pulsing and
I've really been struck by the two central poems, the one about the jellyfishes and the one about the basking shark, this enormous creature that the poet thinks at first is a rock, but it's this enormous thing.
The sea also, to me, it's like a parallel universe. The fact that fish can't survive on land and we can't survive underwater, there's a sort of yin and yang.
If you have a singer and the piano, you would expect the piano to be the sea, right? It would be making crashing wave sounds and it would be tumultuous, and that somehow the singer would be the person, the lyric subject, voicing their encounter with the sea. And so you would have a very straightforward, dialogue between these two entities. But if you add in the cello, it becomes much more interesting, because then you've got the fact that it isn't that straightforward. It isn't just, the human and the sea and the poet and the encounter with the natural world. You've also got the cello, and it's interesting that the cello is used for this kind of, it's also used to represent things like the jellyfish.
the third poem in the sequence is by a Scottish writer, Norman McCaig, again, a poet who I very much respect. And I did remember that he also had written this poem about a strange sea creature.
With words. Julius can see the words and the music in front of him as he works through the score, and I didn't really absorb the words until quite a long time after I had absorbed the notes.
And I often find myself remembering that our interpretation is an interpretation of the composer's interpretation of the poem.
Judith's music, it's so lyrical, it's so beautifully written for the voice. It just sits in a place which means I can really tell a story.
What changes when you put those poems together? I suppose there's lots of elements of change going on. The first level of change is just we add the music. But then the second level of change is how the texts interact with one another in a new form that wasn't intended in that way. They're not a poetic cycle. One of the things that strikes me in these poems is that very, very typical use of the first person. I read this in a kind of philosophical encounter between humanity and the sea, and one of the things that interests me is the fact that it's actually called On the Palmy Beach. The actual focus is on the space where you look at the sea, and there's very much this sense of looking out, and a lot of these poems are about the human gaze on the sea and about what we can learn about ourselves through looking at the sea. I read it in that kind of way as the elemental dialogue between the human and the non-human.
So, who's the monster? The thought made me grow pale. For 20 seconds, I sail after sail, sail after sail.
Very, very often I've included a poem by Emily Dickinson in many of my pieces just because they often are perfect statements at the beginning or end. They have this weird simplicity, but full of complex images. So this one that we end with, I started early, took my dog and visited the sea. You know, just that line, you can't lay it down once you've heard it.
rhythm is a musician's god in that way, isn't it? Like breathing, it's the first life force. Rhythm comes before harmony and before any kind of melody.
If you actually just play something very rhythmically, it will work on one level because it's a bit like a house with nothing else in it. It still is upright because the rhythm is there.
People can misunderstand rhythm as something mechanical. So, and again, that's why it's so beautiful to think of breath or the sea, because there's a hierarchy to rhythmical beats. Something is organic and natural, and that has to be the case with musical rhythm. It can't be something that you could switch on a computer.
It's just so fascinating how rhythm can make or break.
Expectation, isn't it? Because we need a certain expectation of what's happening, and rhythm helps us get there.
There's a very strong sense of not rhythm, and not steady pulse, but it's pulsing. There's something that pulses through. It sways back and forth precisely as you can imagine the underwater currents doing, and the algae doing, and the jellyfish or whatever the creatures are in that sea.
Supposedly, Emily Dickinson never went to the sea, but I thought that actually gives us a sort of special relationship with Emily Dickinson's poem, going to the sea, but only as a sort of mental journey and not as a physical journey. It's such a wonderful poem to close the cycle with because of that last line, the sea withdrew. We've had this temporary encounter with the sea through song, which itself is a very transitory form, and at the end it has this beautiful closure of the sea withdrawing and we're left alone with the memory of that encounter with the sea, which is also the memory of our encounter with the song cycle.